Hey, welcome to this week's coaching video for those of you who are going to be teaching a small group, an adult small group at Dayspring on Sunday morning, April the 26th. If you're the one teaching that small group on campus, then this video is designed to help you get ready to teach that lesson. So go ahead and get the teaching transcript in your hand. You should have it. We are in the Aliens Among Us series. This is your transcript dated April the 26th, where you're going to be teaching from Psalm 25. So let's look at this together, and you can jot some things down along the way that'll help you get ready to teach this lesson, okay? Now, as you see on this intro page of your lesson overview, you're going to be teaching a lesson that's going to accompany the sermon from Sunday, where I'm going to be preaching from 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 through 21, and that particular chapter, or that part of the chapter, is going to talk about the holiness of God, and we're going to see how God wants a holy people. He's always wanted a holy people. So this lesson that you're teaching is on holiness and what it looks like in our life, and really how we achieve holiness in our lives. Now, your lesson on holiness, you're kind of approaching that subject from a backdoor way. You're not really hitting it head on. And in other words, your group may not say, oh, this is a lesson on holiness, until you get to the end. So I think you're going to find that this is going to be a really good complement to the sermon, because I'll be talking about holiness more front and center. You're going to be talking about some principles, and then holiness will kind of slip in through the back door that way. So I think you're going to find it's a good complement. We're not going to be stepping on each other's toes in terms of the content a whole lot. I think you're also going to like this lesson because it's very structured. It's a 3-point lesson, and each of those points have subpoints in them. So if you like that sort of structure and an outline, I think you'll find this easy to maneuver. And I would say this also about this lesson, not just this lesson, but any lesson that you teach. You know, always there are questions inserted into the teaching content, which is designed for you to get the group interacting with you. You know, this lesson, probably more than any, might be one where you determine different questions that you seem to be better questions to you than the ones provided for you, or it might be that you find better times to insert those questions than when your transcript gives it to you. But that's what the lesson is on. It's on holiness. Now look at that front page with me. I want you to see printed there on where it says the primary teaching point that you're trying to communicate. Look at this. It says holiness seems like an impossible goal, and it's because we don't really understand what it is. But here's the line I want you to notice. It says holiness isn't just about turning away from sin. Turning to the right thing is just as important as turning away from the wrong things. Therefore, holiness is also about turning to God. And that's very, very important. Sometimes in our pursuit of holiness, we're talking about the things that we want to turn from. But as you recall in our intro sermon to this series, that being set apart isn't just about turning away from the right things. It's about turning to the right thing. And that's something that I really hope that you communicate in this lesson, because holiness isn't holiness unless we turn in the right direction and to the right thing, okay? So let's look at the lesson together, and you're going to see how it's really structured and how it flows. Now, you've got an introduction on page 2, and it's a lighthearted introduction that starts off with something in pop culture and then leads to King David, and how David was, even though he was larger than life, we find out he's a really ordinary guy and somebody that we can really relate to. So you're going to look at a psalm, which is a song that David wrote. All right, now this brings us to page 3 in your transcript. Let me show you the outline here, kind of the structure of it. You're going to start off, you see on page 3, you're going to start off by reading Psalm 25, and just read all 22 verses there, okay? Or have somebody read it, but you're going to kind of get the whole thing out of the way in terms of reading the whole psalm right there at the beginning. Then you're going to come back and piece by piece look at different parts of it. Now, here's the outline. Look at it on page 3. You're going to start off by talking about the circumstances in life that David faced, that he speaks about in the psalm. And there are 3 circumstances that you're going to point out. Look at them. It starts off on page 3. It talks about fear. So there's one of the circumstances he's dealing with. It's one that leads to fear. Then on page 4, you see the other 2, guilt and loneliness. So in these verses that you're teaching, David dealt with fear. He dealt with guilt. He dealt with loneliness. These are all things that he experienced in life. And again, you've got questions that are inserted there, but you may find better ways or better places to ask those questions to get your group engaged so that you're not just lecturing. So the first point that you have there on pages 3 and 4 are the circumstances that David faced in his life. Now, in point 2, what you're going to teach is how David dealt with those circumstances. And this is really where you're now starting to aim toward that backdoor holiness lesson. How did David deal with these 3 things? Now, what you're going to do, if you look on page 5, you come to the second point, you're going to look at those 3 things again, fear and guilt and loneliness, and you're going to see, what did David do when facing fear? What did David do when feeling guilt? What did David do when he was lonely? So you're going to go back now and look at the psalm and the different verses that show what he did. So on pages 5 and 6, you're just going to cover that. And here's the thing. Here's the answer that you're working toward in this. When David was fearful, what did he do? He turned to God. When David was guilty, what did he do? He turned to God. When David was lonely, guess what he did? He turned to God. And this is that point that you're making that I read to you on the intro page. It's not enough just to change directions. You have to change to the right direction, because there's a principle in life. And this would be a good thing for you to make sure that you really communicate in your lesson, because we're talking about holiness, okay? There is a principle. You're going to turn to something in your life. It's impossible to turn to nothing. You're going to turn to something. So let's say that you're dealing with something like loneliness. Let's use that one for an example. When someone is lonely in life, they're going to try and do something to remedy that loneliness, right? So this may be a question that you ask, or at least one that you're thinking through as you teach it. When somebody is lonely, what are they going to do? They're going to turn somewhere to take care of that loneliness. And there is tons of different directions people may turn to, or tons of different people that they may turn to deal with their loneliness. Some of that is real people. Some of that now in the world we live in is virtual, or maybe not virtual, but people who are online that you may never know. But there are a lot of things that people would do to try and curb those feelings of loneliness. And what we see in David's life is he turned to God. In his loneliness, he turned to God. So he did the same thing in his loneliness. He did the same thing in his guilt. He did the same thing in his fear. And this is what you're really trying to teach in this lesson. That in life and all the circumstances that we face, we have to learn how to turn to God in every circumstance, because we're going to turn to something. And listen, if you turn from one sin and you don't turn to God, it is possible to turn from one sin to another sin. And I personally believe that that is even a worse thing to do. Somehow and in some way, I think that there are, going from sin to sin, I think that there are effects and consequences that are somehow multiplied. And there's a great cross-reference for this that you may even teach as you're talking through this with your group. Matthew chapter 12, I believe it is. Yeah, Matthew 12. Jesus, he's talking about the sign of Jonah, and he uses a little bit of an analogy in there, almost in a parable kind of a fashion. But he talks about an evil spirit who's commanded to leave a house. And Jesus says when that evil spirit leaves a house and doesn't find anywhere else to rest, he'll come back to the house. But Jesus said in the story that he's telling, the way he tells it, he says that spirit comes back with 7 other spirits. And when he comes back in that house, it's way, way bad. And I think that's a good analogy of what happens to us. That if we try and turn from a sin, but don't turn to God, and we turn from a sin, but we don't replace that activity and that energy and that focus and that attention, if we don't replace that with now focus on God and attention to God and all of that, I believe there's some other sin that comes in and inhabits that empty space. We end up turning to another sin or turning back to the original sin. And I think that when we turn back to that original sin, I think that's when it gets really, really ugly, like Jesus is illustrating, maybe even 7 times worse. So what do? when we find that there are things in our life, whether sinful or just emotional or whatever it is, we turn from certain things and we have to replace all of that with God Himself. That's the whole pursuit of holiness. Turning away from something, turning to God. Do you see how all of this works? So that's where your lesson is really leading in all of this. There's a third point that you're going to make. You find that in the middle of page 6. And that's a great point, by the way. In our pursuit of holiness and in our pursuit of walking as Jesus wants us to walk. A great point that you're making there where it says seeking God's will is less about seeking specific answers than it is about seeking general holiness in our lives. And this is where on that third point where all of a sudden your lesson became about holiness, all right? And that's a great point, by the way, that third one. It could almost be a lesson in and of itself, but do your best to fit it into this lesson, all right? You'll complete your time. You've got your conclusion and your group handout time, and let your group work through that group handout time as they finish the lesson up, and then in your conclusion, you can finish it up with the weekly memory verse, which comes from the passage that I'm going to be preaching from. So we're tying all this stuff together and really streamlining our thoughts toward one thing, and that is this: living a holy life. God has always wanted a holy people. He calls us to be holy as He is holy. So maybe between what I'm preaching and what you're teaching, maybe this can really sink deep into the hearts and minds of some people, and maybe the end result will be that people will be living holy lives as God has called us and called them to live. All right? Hey, thanks for tuning in. I hope this was helpful to you. If you need to watch it again and take some more notes, feel free to do so. But otherwise, I'll see you Sunday morning. God bless you.